Excellent. Well, first of all, let me say thank you for that delightful introduction, Jack. That is extremely kind of you, and it is I who thank you for inviting me to be at the FSI. This has really been a very exciting, wonderful moment. I teach this subject in the University for Peace, and I know how difficult it is to talk about it, and how difficult it is even to agree on what it is. So I've been very, very interested in our sharing together on our second day. It's very important to emphasize something that Jack mentioned. I worked for 4 years for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is the group that grew out of the student sit-ins that you saw in the Nashville film. And my first teacher of nonviolent resistance is sitting over here by the window. Jim Lawson is the person who taught us the theories and methods of nonviolent resistance. My job was in Atlanta working to get out the news, and I worked with a man named Julian Bond, and we worked many, many hours a day simply to get out the news. So I'm happy that Howard Barrell is going to have a session and work on the media later on, because the media and nonviolent resistance are symbiotic in their relationship to each other. Each needs the other. So I mention this and I want to highlight it because the reason that I was able to see what I could see in the First Intifada was because I had 4 years at the heart of a mass nonviolent movement. Had I not had that, I would not have been able to understand what I was looking at and observing. And so much of the news coverage was dislocated from the actual process of what was going on that I feel deeply indebted in all of my work to those 4 years working for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee called SNCC, which a historian at our recent anniversary meeting in Raleigh, North Carolina, said was the most important group in United States political history in the post-World War II era. Greatly underrated in historiography, but very significant. So I'm going to have to share with you something of the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because people come from all over the world, and we have to have a certain amount of understanding. I'm going to go briskly. And I know we want to get to questions and answers, and so do I. I enjoy the questions most of all. But I will do a quick review of the history. With the help of the British, who occupied Palestine in 1917 and 1918, the goals of the Zionist movement were to transform Palestine, which was an Arab Islamic country that always had Christians, Muslims, Jews, other minorities, to transform Palestine into what the Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann called a country that is as Jewish as England is English. Zionism was a political movement that developed coterminously, that is, at the same time as Marxism, in Russia in the late 19th century. In 1917, Britain imposed the Balfour Declaration. I will read it very quickly just to make sure that our friends from Asia and Africa and elsewhere are familiar with this. This went through 6 drafts. The Zionist movement had use of the diplomatic pouches of the British Empire. And finally, the wording that was honed out. For those of you from West Papua may not know all the details, Rosa, I'm just going to read it quickly. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, during the 1930s and the 1920s also, Palestinians sought to preserve their way of life from the implementation of the Balfour Declaration. They were referred to as non-Jews in the letter from the British minister, Lord Balfour. Most of the ways that they fought were with the methods we have been discussing all day yesterday and today. Black mourning bans in newspapers when officials visited from London. Tax resistance, non-payment of taxes. Resigning from jobs in the British colonial administration. Women were at the forefront. There was a silent procession in 1933 in which women walked from a mosque to a church in Jerusalem, where Hetham is from, and a Muslim woman spoke in the pulpit of the church. And she said, "All we ask is that you give to us what you have promised the Jews, that is, a state in Palestine." The women then walked back through the drizzling rain to the mosque where a Christian woman spoke and said, "Again, what we are asking is the same rights that you have granted to the Jewish immigrants." Girls and boys left school early. I bet that was a popular method. Strikes, probably the longest strike in history, 174 days, took place in 1936. The demands were, number one, limits on Jewish immigration, number two, restrictions on land sales to Jews, and number three, establishment of a national government. Mark the last one well, because Yusuf and Hetham are still struggling for this last demand of 1936. There were three major episodes of violence during the 1920s and the 1930s, but scholars have very much agreed now that they were aberrations. They were not planned episodes of violence. They broke out in response to things that had occurred. The British and the Zionists, however, responded to the episodes of violence and paid virtually no attention to the meticulous efforts that were being made with nonviolent methods. They dismissed the more indicative nonviolent sanctions. And as the British and Zionists ignored the nonviolent methods, it only reinforced pockets of the Arab community that were advocating violent resistance. And those included the forerunners of today's Islamic revivalist organizations that you read about, Islamic Jihad and Hamas. The forerunners begin at work at this time as the British and Zionists respond to the violence and pay little or no attention to a society that was mobilizing with the classic nonviolent methods. By 1938, says the historian J.C. Hurwitz, these events had taught the lesson that the use of violence as a political weapon produced results that otherwise appeared unobtainable. And so that pattern of responding to violent struggle, but not to the nonviolent opposition of the Palestinians to the Balfour Declaration, over the changes to their land and society, had been entrenched by the 1930s. Of course, in 1933, the Nazis were elected. Migration increased as Jews sought to flee, to preserve their lives, to survive. And many countries around the world, of course, turned them away. The ships were literally turned away, with Jews kept floating on the high seas as they sought a safe harbor to which to flee from Nazism. However, even with Jewish migration, this is an important fact, as the Jews began to migrate into Palestine with increasing numbers, they never comprised more than 1/3 of the population in that time. And the Zionists had only purchased approximately 20% of the land that could be cultivated. Yet on the 29th of November in 1947, the United Nations adopted General Assembly Resolution 181, and it called for partition into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, with a small section to be internationally managed in the holy city of Jerusalem. Both sides, of course, knew that there would be war. And indeed, by the end of 1948, Jewish forces not only held areas that had been designated by the United Nations as the Jewish state, but large areas of the proposed Arab state. The war was devastating for the Arabs. Zionist forces now controlled 3/4 of the country. The UN said 77.4% by the time of the 1949 armistice agreements. What you saw last night in the film, the green line, that was the armistice line. So-called green because in the United Nations they use purple or black when it's permanent. The green line was a non-permanent line because it came out of not a permanent settlement, but an armistice. The war led to 1% of Palestine's Jews being killed, and the new state was soon overwhelmed with immigrants, many of them having survived the European Holocaust. But for the Palestinians, it was catastrophe. 750,000 were driven out or fled or expelled from their homes. Beside those killed, more than half the Arab population fled or were driven out. The Palestinians who were driven out and fled became refugees in the West Bank, Gaza, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. Here's the key point. They were mostly small farmers, peasants, who only knew how to till the land. The elites were able to have more options. It was those who could only eke out a living on the land who ended up in the refugee camps. The Arab state never emerged. The remaining quarter of the country, what became the West Bank and Gaza, what we talk about now as the West Bank and Gaza, is the remaining 1/4 of historic Palestine. Lock that in your mind. Came under control of Jordan and Egypt. That is, non-Palestinian Arabs were now in control of the remaining 1/4 of historic Palestine. In the 1950s, in the refugee camps in those surrounding countries, the ideologies of armed struggle began to be drummed. People who were unable to survive, who couldn't till the land, began talking about what are we going to do. And ideologists began saying armed struggle is the only way that we can liberate Palestine. The PLO began to be formed in the early 1960s. They are refugees and exiles. Mark this point well, because the PLO will not understand what is happening inside the remaining 1/4 of Palestine as events begin to change in the late 1980s. They are outside. They have not been home for many years. And in 1964, at a summit meeting in Cairo, the charter called for opening military training camps for Palestinians for a liberation battle to be fought by armed force. In 1968, the charter was revised and stipulated armed struggle as policy, the only way to liberate Palestine. Subsequently, most of the attacks by the PLO combatants were on civilians. Banned by Israel until 1970, the PLO's base was in Jordan, after which it moved to Lebanon, from which it was routed by Israel's invasion of Beirut in 1982, and it ended up in Tunisia. So we have the refugees who are in the PLO are moving further and further and further and further away from Palestine. They are less and less and less in touch with developments. In 1967, the war resumed. Israel occupied the remaining 1/4 of the land. That included Budras and all the villages we saw last night in the West Bank and Gaza. Military occupation meant martial law. And it also meant the banning of all political activity. But in 1969, the Communist Party decided to break the ban against political organizing. The Communist Party had historic links to the Communist Party in Israel. And much as this may surprise you, the Communist Party was opposed to armed struggle. The Communists said, armed struggle will not produce anything meaningful for us, that is the Palestinian communists. What we need to be doing is organizing small, independent, micro institutions, learning how to run them, to make decisions. That is our road to independence, the development of autonomous institutions. And soon, the allure of the organizing being done by the communists captured Fatah, the main large party or military cadre of the PLO, which really didn't stand for anything. It was just my homeland, blah, 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 homeland. Would you agree, Hitham?
Yes, I would.
Okay. So very soon there was some allure to becoming involved in organizing small groups. And now we begin building toward what eventually is called the First Intifada. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, small groups of organizations begin to form. Youth, sports, doctors, teachers, nurses, women's organizations. There's even a prisoners movement. At one point, 15,000 Palestinian prisoners are on hunger strike in dispersed Israeli jails, that is, prisons all over Israel and in the occupied territories, simultaneously on one day, with no means of communication. 15,000 Palestinian prisoners are on hunger strike. So within Palestinian society in the 1970s and the 1980s is tremendous amount of organizing activity. Those of you who are academicians will later call this the formation of civil society. Well, you can call it whatever you want, but it represents the dispersal of independent power centers. And a very important book by Gene Sharp called Social Power and Political Freedom says that there's a direct correlation between independent power centers and dispersal of power and the ability to mount successful nonviolent struggle. The more independent, autonomous groups there are in a society, the more it's possible to survive in a nonviolent mobilization. In December 1987, something happened. There were 4 Palestinians who were killed at a checkpoint. And the preceding year had been very, very difficult. And I'm making things go very, very fast here. There were suddenly funerals at which 30,000 Palestinians turned out, and even larger numbers. And it cut across all strata of society. So you had black-suited barristers, like the lawyers' movement in Pakistan. They look just like the lawyers' movement. They're black suits. And all the way to young people in huge turnout for funerals of people who were killed at that checkpoint. And the word intifada was used for what happened in December 1987. Intifada is a word that in Arabic, Yusuf, you will correct me if I'm wrong, means shaking off. Shaking off. Those who spoke English chose the word uprising to give its meaning, but its literal meaning, shaking off. It's very important because there was no hostility in that word. It's not violent, it's not retaliatory, it's not vengeful. It's a shaking off of military occupation. And as one scholar described it to me, it means when you wake up and you get up and you stretch, you go like that. He said, that's intifada. So we always have problems with what do you call it. Every single movement has problems with what do you call it. Even the word nonviolence is a terrible word in English. It doesn't tell you what it is. tells you what it's not. Now, the news media gave tremendous coverage, but they largely missed the point. What was actually taking place was that the entire Palestinian society was unifying to work to lift Israeli military occupation with exactly the same methods we've been discussing. Along the way, something else historic, very important happened. In 1980, joint Israeli-Palestinian committees began working together, marching together. English was the lingua franca. Not everybody spoke Hebrew, not everybody spoke Arabic, but everybody spoke English. And so in everything they did, their signs, their press releases, their pickets, their petitions, everything was in 3 languages as they worked together. They stood in sharp contrast to the military cadres related to Fatah, the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the DFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And it's not important for you to get these names, just there were military cadres associated with the PLO that was out there, had linkages and identifications within the occupied territory. However, within the occupied territories, there was very little allure to armed struggle, because whenever anyone came across the borders from Lebanon or Syria or Jordan to carry out a cross-border operation, the retaliation for it fell on the people of the occupied territories. And so there was really very great disenchantment with armed struggle. I can say more about that later. Something else was going on as well. There were activist intellectuals, very much like the activist intellectuals that Jack mentioned yesterday, who were at work in Eastern Europe. There was a similar group of about 24 activist intellectuals. These are people based in universities, but who emerged during the 1980s. The Israelis had allowed universities to develop, and because the Palestinians could have no other form of self-governance, the student and faculty union had become the largest political institution in Palestinian society. As the activist intellectuals had tremendous influence and clout and were able to have a profound effect in a society, but they're still under martial law, still under occupation. They can't run training programs like what Vanessa Ortiz has done and others have done in the Palestinian areas. You can't say, well, we're going to have a meeting and all of you come and learn about nonviolent struggle. That was impossible under military occupation. So the activist intellectuals are working through leaflets, through materials, through articles, and they're publishing. And this was the first real harbinger that there was profound political change underway in the thinking about what to do about the military occupation. In 1983, workshops started to teach nonviolent action, but the Israelis tried to close them down immediately. Mubarak Awad organized with Jonathan Kutab something called the Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence in East Jerusalem, and began disseminating tremendous numbers of translated materials. The Politics of Nonviolent Action by Gene Sharp was translated into Arabic. Lots and lots of publications. Most of the materials said that armed struggle would not work under the conditions of military occupation, with Israel particularly being backed by the United States to the degree that it has been. Pilot exercises on nonviolent action began in about 40 or 50 small Palestinian villages. And it was often explained in very non-technical terms, not talking the way that Hardy and Janet and Jack are talking, but using very simple terms like nonviolent struggle means when something happens, you don't run away, you stand. Tax resistance in the village of Beit Sahur was a classic textbook example. If any of you just want to dip into the literature and read something quickly, read about the village of Beit Sahur, where there were something like 38 popular committees. So what are the popular committees? Once the Intifada began in December 1987, there began to be harmonized actions all over the occupied territories. You would see a march and then a march, a procession and a procession, a strike, a closing of a school, a closing of a school. It was obvious to the onlooker by the dispersal of these activities that there was some kind of coordination underway, or else they would have all taken place in the population centers in East Jerusalem and Bethlehem, but they were all over the occupied territory, so clearly some communication was underway. The Israeli reaction to these harmonized actions was very, very fierce, and reprisals were slapped down almost immediately. But the women's groups that had been organizing during the 1970s and the 1980s just morphed. If you don't have English as a native speaker, what is another way of saying morphing? They slid. They slid from the women's committees of the 1980s into the popular committees of the Intifada. Most of the popular committees in the First Intifada were led and run by women, and they had learned their organizational skills during the preceding 2 decades. By December 1989, 1 million Palestinians were under curfew and confined to their homes. The universities were all closed down. 14,500 students and faculty were sent back to their villages. It turns out that this is one of the greatest things that happened as far as the transmission of knowledge about fighting with nonviolent methods, because in the refugee camps in small villages, the physics professor would sit with the baker and discuss how to distribute bread under curfew. So you would have a professor of philosophy sitting with the butcher to discuss how shall we distribute meat. Some refugee camps were put under 23-hour curfew, which meant that there was only 1 hour a day, in which usually women would slip out of the camp to buy meat and vegetables. But then the question was, how could you distribute that internally? Very sophisticated organizing going on within those refugee committees. Non-cooperation with the occupation became the banner of the First Intifada, partly based on the studies of all the translated materials and the writing of a man named Seti Nusseibeh, who wrote arguing that the occupation is able to persist only because we obey it. If we cease to cooperate with the military occupation, it cannot persist. Periodic leaflets began to appear. They were numbered and dated. None of them, I've done this research, none of them called for the destruction of Israel. None of them called for death to the Jews. They were all asking for the lifting of military occupation, very much reminiscent of the way Ayed spoke last night when he said, we are not against anybody. We just want to raise our families. We want to preserve our way of life. If you look for sort of streams of thinking in the leaflets, there were 3 main demands. One is we accept Israel in its pre-1967 borders. 2, we would like the removal of Israeli authority from what remains of our land. And 3, we need the establishment of the Palestinian state, which had been promised and repromised by the British at the same time they were promulgating the Balfour Declaration, and which they have still not achieved. Also in the leaflets is an 18-month debate on whether the Palestinians should go to total civil disobedience. It's fascinating to read. There are big pros and cons. It would be extremely exhausting for the Palestinians to engage in what they call total civil disobedience, which was total breaking of all aspects of the military occupation. From December 1987 to March 1988, women alone held more than 100 demonstrations. But was the uprising truly nonviolent? Weren't stones thrown? Well, you saw last night that the older women tried to stop the young people from throwing stones. But Israel-Palestine is rocky soil, and so the stones are everywhere. And as Heatham will tell you, For the settlements that were being implanted, a colonial implant into the remaining, really less than a quarter, 22% of what had been historic Palestine, the stone being quarried to build the settlements was from the Palestinian land. So the stones are everywhere. And not every Palestinian has sat in training workshops or read Mubarak's leaflets or studied Gene Sharp's translations, or so that young people start to throw stones. So this had a frightening effect for Israelis who saw the stones as projectiles that could be lethal. And with more prudent strategic thinking, I believe the stones should have been withheld because it complicated the picture enormously. But I wanted to get to the bottom of the question of whether it was nonviolent. So I went to the Israel Defense Force, the IDF, and fortunately was able to work with the former psychologist Reuven Gal, who set me up to talk with the spokesperson of the IDF. And what he told me is that over a 4-year period of the Intifada, only 12 Israeli soldiers were slain of all the thousands that were deployed in the occupied territories. Now, what you need to remember is that they were everywhere, on rooftops, patrolling streets, in the alleyways, in the markets. No numbers are published, but I have seen one figure for 70,000. I don't know whether it's accurate or not, to be frank. This information is very closely held. But only 12 Israeli soldiers were killed, according to the IDF, over a period of 4 years. What that does tell us as students of nonviolent civil resistance is there was tremendous, phenomenal restraint being manifested by the population, and enormous unity and planning and discipline, to pick up Hardy's themes, because you couldn't have that withholding of violent retaliation without unity, planning, and discipline. So I'll speed up on what actually happened, because we want to get to the questions. Eventually, the guiding group, which was called the Command, it was unseen, no one knew who sat on it. It was made up of the 4 different groups I mentioned: the Communist Party, Fatah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The fact that the Communist Party is in there amongst the other 3 military cadres is quite significant, because the Communist Party never advocated armed struggle, and they were small. It was basically 1,000 members, mostly teachers. But the Communist Party had achieved such political status as a result of advocating for the organizing of small independent institutions that they were included in the Command. Eventually, 4 waves of arrests hit at the Command, which was completely clandestine. It never met. I was able to interview individuals who had sat on it from all 4 of the groups. And if you read my book, Quiet Revolution, I actually tell you how it worked. We don't have time for that right now. But eventually they were hit with 4 separate waves of arrests, so that after the 4th wave of arrest, you no longer had anyone on the Command who had gone through the kind of conscientization, preparation, study that had been gone through by the people who were attending the workshops and reading the materials. And Gene Sharp makes trips to the West Bank and Israel during that time. He meets with lots and lots of Israelis, and they'd never heard him speak, they'd never read the materials, they'd never been to the workshops. They don't understand nonviolent struggle. And eventually, the Israelis begin picking off, deporting, or arresting all of the activist intellectuals who were involved in bringing about these profound changes in political thinking, are picked off systematically by the Israelis. And at that point, various self-appointed groups begin coming back and reasserting violence. Ineffective violence, the kind that Janet was talking about this morning, with these self-appointed militias who were trying to set up traps to catch the Israeli soldiers and this sort of thing. But fundamentally, the opportunities presented by this pivotal moment were squandered by 3 parties that could have done something to help. Israel denied that it was a nonviolent uprising. Israel called it 7th war. They called it violent. The United States and the international community essentially looked the other way. And the PLO, what was the PLO worried about? The PLO was worried about the fact that their leadership might be displaced. They did not want new leadership, new Yusufs and Hithams arising in the occupied territories. And remember what I said, they're outside, they're refugees. They've not been home since 1948, and they've been traveling to these Arab capitals further and further away until they're in North Africa. They absolutely did not comprehend the First Intifada or what was going on. And to make it worse, Yasser Arafat talked about the young people in the First Intifada as our generals. So he uses military terminology for what was in fact an extraordinarily disciplined nonviolent movement. Once everybody's locked up or deported who had been influential in changing the thinking, the PLO actually takes over the command in March 1990. And the leaflets start calling for general strikes. It's very, 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 very easy to call a general strike. You issue a call for a general strike, but you can't do it very often because the people become exhausted. It's a tool that renders itself ineffective very, very swiftly, if not carefully planned. You would share that from the Zimbabwe experience. You can't call a general strike every other day. But that was the only method that the PLO people who were now writing the leaflets understood. So, did it accomplish anything? Yes. All of those hijackings and military operations, some of the worst terrorist operations in the 20th century carried out by the PLO, were not able to accomplish what the First Intifada was able to accomplish. It brought about the 1991 Madrid International Conference. This was the first time that the Israelis and the Palestinians had sat down opposite each other in the same room. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir tried to prevent even that. He said the Palestinian delegates should be buried in the Jordanian delegation. And they were, although they included many of the activist intellectuals I've been talking about. So, what else happened? The implications of the First Intifada are actually seismic if you care anything about the peoples of the Middle East, and I mean all the peoples. If you care anything about the Israelis and the Arabs and the Palestinians in the Middle East, the implications of the First Intifada are seismic. The Intifada was egalitarian, it was cooperative, it was democratic. Those popular committees were a profound experience in democratic governance and the making of decisions. When the leaflets were issued by the command, they were called appeals. The popular committees could accept the bid if they said, on Tuesday, everybody will fly a Palestinian flag outside their window. This popular committee over here could say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do it on Saturday instead. The popular committees could make their own decisions. Secondly, it opened up Palestinian thinking. There is not much debate in the Arab world, is there, Yusuf? Wouldn't you agree with me? There's not a great deal of debate in the Arab world on issues pertaining to democracy and self-determination and leadership and other issues having to do with self-governance and self-determination.
I agree with you that many Arab countries, they don't like that they're seen in having this democratic state because they are fear of if any transformation happened in Palestine, all these monarchies, they would fall down immediately.
Exactly. They were afraid that these ideas would spread.
And maybe the only democratic, so to say, even under the occupation is the Palestinians.
Thank you. That is the point I was about to make. The Palestinians in the First Intifada coined the most authentic manifestation of democracy that the Arab world has ever seen. It also developed civil society. We can use this term. All of that proliferation of independent institutions. And the good news is that this is essential for coexistence. This is essential for the future. This is essential if there is ever to be democracy for the Palestinians. Not only that, and we could talk about this more at some length, the capacity to criticize any government that emerges for the Palestinians will be related back to the First Intifada. The normal inclination will not be to encourage criticism. And there will be forms of despotism to arise amongst Palestinian ranks, Heatham, because the Palestinians are human beings. This is true everywhere. The experience of the First Intifada is a tremendous buffer to help with the prevention of despotism in a future Palestinian state. So the leadership that emerged was the most egalitarian and committed to democracy. So I think we'll stop right there and we'll open it up for questions. I hope, Marianne, I'm not running too late. Am I running too late? Jack? Am I doing okay on the questions? Okay, good. So who would like to lead off with a question? Or protestation?
We have again a wave of nonviolent actions in Palestine, and I would like to know your opinion about the opportunities it can gain comparing to what the First Intifada did. Because the context has changed since the Oslo Agreement. It's not the civil administration of Israel. It's also a kind of Palestinian authority responsibility. So what are the difference and the opportunities of the 2 days movement?
Well, the differences are profound because the Palestinians have actually, in some ways, improved their lot a great deal from the First Intifada. We have Heatham here, who's organizing a committee against the settlements. We have Yusuf. They are indicative of the kind of leadership that's available and able to operate with relative freedom. And they don't have to be hiding in Birzeit University or Bethlehem University and putting out papers at night. And the leaflets were disseminated, incidentally, often by young people who could memorize them, because the Palestinians had emphasized rote learning. It turned out to be an asset in the First Intifada, because if the Israeli soldiers found you carrying the leaflets, you'd be popped into jail immediately. But the Palestinian young people had learned how to memorize, so they'd memorize the whole leaflet and go at night from village to village and share under cover of darkness what that week's or that bi-weekly leaflet was called. It's not necessary anymore. You have huge communications outlets. You have coexistence in cyberspace. You have Israelis and Palestinians working together in cyberspace. The Israeli-Palestinian committees that were working together in the early 1980s had tremendous difficulties. It was against the law to do that. Today, there's a much more open situation. But the problems are also very different because we now have all of the networks of, some people call them Jewish-only roads. They're roads that you can only drive on if you have an Israeli license tag. We have a huge implantation of settlements has occurred under both Labor and Likud governments. The situation is more complex with the rise of Hamas. I was one of the observers in 2006 in the elections that got Hamas elected. I live in Washington, D.C. We were all saying, oh, we need these people to come and organize elections in the United States because they have done such a good job. I mean, Hamas did a bang-up job in organizing the elections. So you've got elections, you have much more commerce, you have the outside world more informed and more knowledgeable about the true circumstances. You have more Israelis who are troubled and perturbed by the policies of their government. Jack mentioned this morning the psychological factors. Who have we become? Who are we? Is this who we are? Many, many, many Israelis saying, who are we? What have we become? Is this who we are? So the situation is different in almost every way. Yes?
Thank you. Jack mentioned the fact that you chose the title of your book as The Quiet Revolution, while Palestine is one of the noisiest places in the world. So why did you choose these titles?
Because of the movement of ideas. I'll just give you a few examples. The two-state solution. Does everybody know that term? Two-state solution? What it means is two states living side by side, Israel and Palestine living side by side. The two-state solution was first accepted in Palestinian refugee camps during the First Intifada. And this was a real breakthrough because until that point, the PLO was always talking about liberation. Inside the First Intifada, the activist intellectuals started writing about it as independence. Because if I say, I want to liberate my country from your occupation, it means it carries connotations of vanquishment or kicking you out. Independent is a much more assertive stance that doesn't say anything about the other. It just says, we want independence. So that the term independence had completely supplanted the term liberation. These are quiet changes of political thought that were occurring. The Palestinians were saying, we cannot kick out the Israelis. They were born here. We were born here. We must find ways to share the land. These are very, very deep changes that are taking place in political thought. And they have nothing to do with all that noise and racket or hijackings. But there were profound shifts in the way that people thought about their dilemma and thought about sharing the land that had once been theirs. And so when Hitham says the two-state solution, there are years of processing and modification of political thought that go on behind that change. So as I thought about it, I thought this is really, it's truly revolutionary. Thought guides action, but it's quiet, it's sub rosa, it's below the surface. You can't even see it unless you're looking for it or listening very, very deeply. Hitham.
Yeah. First of all, I mean, I've heard many, obviously, presentations about Palestine and Palestinian history, and I can say with great confidence that was the best presentation given the time.
Thank you.
One of the points that you touched upon, which was very, very important, and we haven't really been thinking about it much, but it's very clear right now, which is when the PLO harvested the great momentum the First Intifada had gained for its own benefit, and we were just talking about this earlier, they thought that they had made it into leadership, and they don't need the Intifada anymore. What the Intifada had achieved was leveraged Palestinians to a stage where they can negotiate equally with Israelis during Oslo. Israel wouldn't negotiate with Palestinians given its military arsenal and everything it has and its occupation, but it was the First Intifada and its outcomes that got the PLO to that stage. Now, unfortunately, we Palestinians accepted the dismantling of the First Intifada, all those popular committees and everything that came out of it, and the PLO suddenly found itself alone, facing Israel, who are not committing to agreements and interim agreements in Oslo and so on. But what's changing now, today, is that the Palestinian Authority is realizing that it has nothing without the people themselves. And this was pretty much the inspiration of the campaign that I'm working with in terms of boycotting settlement products. Palestinian negotiators are negotiating with Israelis saying, we don't want a Palestinian state that is pretty much a rat maze of walls and settlements and so on. The Israelis would not listen to them, obviously. The Palestinian Authority find themselves under a lot of international pressure to a point where they feel that they are about to perhaps break. So they feel suddenly that they need a popular movement, going back to the days of the First Intifada, where Palestinians themselves are saying, we don't recognize a solution with the existence of settlements. And this is what is leveraging back the PA to some extent. It's gaining the trust of people to some extent, because so far the PA has been perceived, as Janet mentioned, the BLA, as she mentioned a certain attribute I don't want to mention, so Yusuf wouldn't report it back to the government. But yes, that's how it's been perceived. Going back to popular resistance, going back to people actually leading things, is what the Palestinian Authority is realizing is the important thing right now.
Thank you. I want to hold up a piece of what Hitham said and just put a little punctuation around it. Where you have severe asymmetries, severely lopsided sides to a conflict, the only way that the weaker party may be able to equalize itself with the other party may be through nonviolent struggle. As long as the Palestinians were talking about armed struggle, and by the way, I conducted many interviews in which the Palestinians said, well, if we're going to use armed struggle, fine, but be effective with it, not this little cross-border skirmishing here and there. They were really completely disenchanted with that, but the armed struggle could never get them to the point of negotiation with the Israelis. It was the Intifada that equalized the power, and it was because they were not attacking the Israelis, they were attacking the sources of power of Israel, and because they had so many Israeli peace groups, more than 100 new Israeli peace groups came into existence to support the First Intifada. And those that were moribund revived and suddenly, gave themselves new names and new projects and new involvements and so on. So they were able to reach the negotiations in Madrid in 1991 only because of the First Intifada. Yitzhak Shamir had come out of a terror group called the Sterngang. Israel has had 2 prime ministers who came from terrorist organizations prior to 1948. Menachem Begin came out of Ergun Tzvi Leumi, and both of them became prime ministers. So they couldn't stand on any moral ground, but they refused to talk with the Palestinians. The First Intifada made that impossible. James Baker, who was Secretary of State for President Bush, the first President Bush, actually had 8 meetings with leaders, the activist intellectual leaders that I've been talking about, en route to Madrid 1991. So by that time, the U.S. had become persuaded that there was something that could be built upon, something important had been established here. This is a really important point where there are great asymmetries. It may be the only way that you can get into that next stage of obtaining your goals. Maybe nonviolent struggle for very sheer power reasons. Howard?
Quickly, Jack spoke earlier today about the mind of the movement. How would you characterize the mind of the current Israeli government, and how rationally fit do you think it is?
Well, is that part of my remit in this lunch?
How'd it go?
Well, Israel's proportional representation makes it always vulnerable to the most extreme political parties. And Netanyahu is sitting on top of a cobbled coalition that's extremely weak and vulnerable politically. And so I feel that he has very limited political space. It's therefore incumbent upon the world community and the Palestinians to be as shrewd as possible and to realize that he has very little political space. So they've got to be careful. It's a very dangerous moment. There's obviously a certain amount of desperation. The reaction to the flotilla reveals that. And interestingly enough, all of the Israeli spokespersons were using the term passive resistance. Oh, we expected passive resistance, they said. The New York Times picked it up. Ethan Bronner, the Jerusalem bureau chief, started writing about passive resistance. My goodness, Gandhi rejected this term in 1906. Gandhi thought it was so inadequate for discussing the kind of power he was talking about that he held a contest to figure out the best one word that could explain what we would today call nonviolent resistance or nonviolent civil resistance. So you could see in the military spokespersons that the isolation, detachment from the worldview, I think that the government of Israel is in a very difficult and vulnerable position right now. I think they're extremely vulnerable to more well-planned nonviolent civil resistance. But it's got to be well-planned. We're going to be talking about that in my breakout session on Thursday. For those of you who've signed up, we're going to be doing a simulation. Masha?
As a person that is really far from this region, unfortunately, yet, as a stupid question maybe, but for all the Palestinians here as well, what we've seen yesterday in the movie that I really enjoyed is a real, peaceful resistance. However, we all know that there are lots of suicide bombers that are...
But there are what?
Suicide bombers and attackers that are exploding themselves in Israel, killing when Israeli soldiers is okay, but Israeli civilians is not that smart. I want to know who are they and what, I want to hear from the Palestinians, where do they come from and how does it go together with this real, history of peaceful and non-violent resistance that we have
Very
described?
quickly, I mentioned that the roots of the Islamic revivalist organizations go back into the 1930s. And Hamas has its roots in that period, ideologically and methodologically. They also have martyrology, that is, a conviction that nothing is greater than to become a martyr for the cause of one's belief. And the suicide bombs that come from Hamas, one of the things you need to remember is that they are casting these homemade rockets. They are homemade. They are homemade. You will not understand that from reading the newspapers, but they are homemade. They're casting them into their former farms. However, whenever Hamas has established a ceasefire, it has abided by it. Israel broke the ceasefire. Had Israel truly been concerned about the security of its citizens, it had only to adhere to the ceasefire. So the suicide bombers will continue to be a problem. Yusuf, are you from Jenin, did you tell me? Jenin is another one of the communities that has produced a lot of suicide bombers. They now have other activities underway, the Jenin Freedom Theater, other groups that are at work to give young people other ways to express their frustration and anger and so on. But it will continue to be a problem because of the martyrology of some of the movements. And so it's extremely important that those who advocate nonviolent methods see results. This is the problem. If there are no fruits for the discipline and the incredible work that an entire society must engage in to fight nonviolent, if there are no fruits, it's inevitable that the extremists will come back in. And that is what has happened again and again in this situation. It's why it's urgent that there be efforts made to resolve this once and for all. Yes?
Well, thank you, first of all. This was a great talk. I wanted to know what you thought about framing the issue. I've kind of given up. I'm from New York City, and I'm often called a self-loathing Jew. And I've given up on reaching a lot of people. I think that some people are just lost causes. But I do think that there's this population out there that, like Peter Beinart refers to this in the recent article that some of you probably have read. People who are not mobilized and not organized, but are not necessarily sympathetic to, certainly not sympathetic to Likud, right? And I don't know if there's a movement in the United States that uses a language that brings people in to this movement that doesn't. I see a real lack of flexibility in terms of framing and ideology. And I guess I want to know how plausible you think an alliance between people who care about Israel more than Palestinians, which is totally problematic, but I think exists. How possible is an alliance between people like that and people who actually care about human rights and all people equally? Is there a kind of the possibility of a pragmatic alliance that would push Israel away from being so hawkish?
Yes. Yes. I want to be careful not to give a one-off, single option answer to your question because it's a very important and profound question that you're asking. But there is a new organization called the J Street Lobby, which is led by young, one of them is a former IDF soldier, one of them is the descendant from the pioneers of Israel. They have tremendous credentials as far as Judaism and Zionism are concerned. And they are conducting this summer training programs for about 15,000 campus leaders to do precisely what you're talking about, to discuss how to articulate a love of Israel, a concern for Israel, with the fact that they are deeply concerned about the survival of the state if it stays on what they see as a self-destructive, if not suicidal course. This is a quote from Jeremy Ben-Ami, incidentally, with whom I recently met. They also now have a rabbinic cabinet, which is made up of 500 rabbis and rabbinical students who are declaring themselves openly in support of the J Street Lobby. For those of you who don't live in Washington, D.C., you need to know that there is no J Street. This is a capital city that has HIJKLMN. There's no J Street in Washington, D.C. And so they said, we'll call ourselves the J Street Lobby because that would stand for Judaism or Jewish. And they're young, they're very careful. As I mentioned, I just had a meeting with them. One of the people who came to the meeting, young Andrew, had been a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco. Where's Mohammed? Mohammed, are you here? Anyway, he'd been a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco, had learned to speak Arabic, then went to Cairo to do his PhD, and he's working for the J Street Lobby now. His picture of Israel is Israel rooted in the Middle East, dealing with all of the countries of the Middle East, not something whose affinity and identity is with Europe. So I think that Beinert's article really tapped into something significant that's underway, and I would never say that this is the answer, but I think it's indicative of changes that you're going to see. And one of the things they're trying to do is to build alliances with Hillel organizations. These are on-campus Jewish organizations that are more traditional, and they want to learn how to work with Hillel. So they're doing trainings in working with Hillel. So it's a very positive, healthy development. Thank you.
Will be receptive to them, given that?
No, Israel refused to send anybody to speak at their convention, but Israel is shifting very, very rapidly now. Yesterday's news says that the Gaza blockade will be lifted, that things will be let in. Anything that's not prohibited will be let in. Instead of nothing goes in unless it's on the list. Yusuf is justifiably skeptical about whether this will actually be implemented. I appreciate that given the history, but there obviously are changes and shifts underway.
Mary, thank you so much.
Yes, indeed.